Association of Scholars' ongoing webinar series on the great American novel. Today, our topic is Owen Wister's The Virginian. My name is Gary Scharnhorst, and I'll be moderating today's event. In just a moment, you'll hear from our panelists. But first, I want to give you an idea of what to expect from today's event. After I introduce our speakers, each of them will have 12 to 14 minutes to discuss the novel. At the conclusion of their remarks, I will read questions from you, the audience, to our panelists. Please feel free to submit questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen during the event. If your questions don't get answered, you can send them to the National Association of Scholars at contact@nas.org to be forwarded to the panelists. The event will be recorded, and a link to the recording will be sent to the email address you used to register. Thank you very much for joining us for this event. So without further ado, let me introduce our speakers for today in alphabetical order. I should add that each of us has a surname that's difficult to pronounce. Dr. Blake Allmendinger is Professor of American Literature at the University of California, Los Angeles, where he specializes in literature of the American West. He's the author of The Cowboy Representations of Labor in an American Work Culture, 10 Most Wanted, The New Western Literature, Imagining the African American West, and The Melon Capital of the World, a Memoir. He is also co-editor of Over the Edge, Remapping the American West, and has been awarded fellowships from the American Council of Learned Societies and the National Endowment for the Humanities. Dr. Richard W. Etulain is Professor Emeritus of Western American History at the University of New Mexico, where he edited the New Mexico Historical Review and directed the Center for the American West. He is the author or editor of 60 volumes, including Thunder in the West, The Life and Legends of Billy the Kid, The American West, a 20th Century History, which was nominated for the Pulitzer Prize, Reimagining the Modern American West, a Century of Fiction, History, and Art, and Conversations, Wallace Stegner on History and Literature. Professor Etulain has also served as president of both the Western Literature Association and the Western History Association. Dr. Alan Weltzien, Professor Emeritus of English at the University of Montana Western, retired in 2020 after a 40-year teaching career. He has been the recipient of Fulbright fellowships to Poland and Bulgaria, and University of Montana International Faculty Awards to Australia and France. He has published 11 books, including a biography of the Montana novelist Thomas Savage, and served as a consultant for Jane Campion's cinematic adaptation of Savage's novel, The Power of the Dog. In 2022, Weltzien published a poetry chapbook entitled Through the Basement of Time, a prose chapbook entitled When the Smiles Stopped, and a collection of poetry entitled On the Beach, Poems 2016 to 2021. Finally, I'm Gary Scharnhorst, Distinguished Professor Emeritus of English at the University of New Mexico. I'm the author or editor of over 50 books, including an annotated edition of The Virginian and a biography of Owen Wister, and I edit the scholarly journal American Literary Realism. I'm reminded of a story about the poet T.S. Eliot. who also edited a little magazine called Criterion. He was once asked whether all editors are failed writers. He replied, yes, but then so are most writers. Fortunately, among the participants in the discussion today, that generalization applies only to me. And with that, I would turn to Professor Allmendinger for his presentation.
Thank you, Gary. When I was asked to not prepare remarks, but to speak about the Virginian today, I started thinking about it. And I remember back when I was in graduate school at UPenn, thinking that I was going to write a dissertation on 19th century British humorous novelists like Charles Dickens. I had never given much of a thought to Western literature at all, even though I grew up on a cattle ranch. And it only got to the point in graduate school after wasting 3 years of taking courses in what turned out to be all the wrong fields for me, that I realized as much as I like people like Dickens, I had nothing new to say about him. Once I finally switched over to the American West, which is a long story in itself, kind of happened at the last minute at Penn, and people were surprised. But one of the first things I encountered was the name Owen Wister. And so on my own, I found the book, not surprisingly, because as I later discovered, it probably is the novel that started the whole Western genre, or even if you trace it back to the dime novel before Wister, you have to give him credit for still doing quite a lot to help establish the formula that came later. So I wrote a little bit about him in my first book, The Cowboy, and then ever since then, I've had cause to re-encounter him again and again throughout my career. I taught him numerous times. In one of my very first graduate courses, I taught a young guy named Bill Handley, who ended up writing a book which included a chapter on Wister, a very good book published by Cambridge University Press. I would highly recommend it if somebody's approaching the subject for the first time. I had numerous other occasions to teach over the years to undergraduates as well as to graduate students. And most recently, I had an opportunity to re-encounter the novel because I have a colleague in my department, a woman who specializes in the Renaissance of all people, Shakespeare. But her story is that she was born and raised in New Hampshire. And she was hired a couple of years after me, but she's definitely a totally East Coast person, and never came out west until she got the job here. Ended up marrying a guy who's known in Malibu as kind of a horse whisperer. Comes from a very, I think, a very wealthy family. His mother was married 4 times. And each time she married someone who was richer, who had even more land than the past husband did. So now they essentially apparently own all of Brentwood, and I didn't know it. But she was intrigued by the plot of the Virginian because it's about an Eastern schoolmarm who comes out west and meets his cowboy. And she felt in some ways that was a story of her own life. And so she started reading the Virginian, and then she wrote a piece for the LA Review of Books, I think. But in the process, she asked me if I had read another novel with the very uncatchy title of The Administratrix by, what's her name? Something Emma Gent, I think, Ghent. And that novel was published, I found out, 13 years before the Virginian. And it tells a very similar story. Again, I didn't know anything about it until she pointed it out, but it's about a young woman, a schoolmarm from Illinois who goes to Colorado and falls in love with a rancher who is killed for allegedly rustling someone else's sheep, her cattle. And once she's widowed, she decides to cross-dress as a man and go undercover and discover which rustler among the rival gang actually was the one who did the dirty deed, and then get her vengeance on the people who hanged her husband, who was innocent. And it sounded like a great story, and I got about a chapter into it, and it was so tediously written that I couldn't go forward any longer. And I kind of began to understand why the novel was still obscure, but it made me appreciate Wister's novel even more. And I don't see any evidence that he was influenced by her novel. I'm not aware that he even read it or that many people did, but Wister himself writes so well that it makes me understand how his novel was able to become as successful as it was. And that made me appreciate it even more. It's a terrific novel. And if you read it before you get into formula Westerns, I feel like it kind of spoils you because you're reading the best of the best up front. And then after that, you're reading people like who are more formulaic and whom I enjoy reading and who also have their definite place in the field, but they were definitely kind of exploring that same territory that Owen Wister had previously explored. And I'm kind of curious now what will be the relationship between readers and Wister going forward into the 21st century, whether he will continue to have this influence or not. You know, sometimes I think about with our field, the American West, I wonder whether regionalism is in danger of disappearing because of transnationalism and the dissolution of borders, both kind of within academia and more in the popular conversation. And I hope that in the effort to, look at the world's literatures from a more global comparative perspective, that we don't leave out regions that are important in their own right. So I'll just start by saying that, and then I'll listen, take notes, and answer any questions you might have.
Thank you. Thank you, Blake. And let me then turn to Dick Etulain. So you're up, Dick.
Okay. I want to make my presentation based on 3 words. The first of the words is inheritance. So the things that Wister inherited as a writer. Secondly, I want to talk about his contributions that he made himself. And then I'd like to talk about the legacies of Owen Wister. So those 3 are the words that I'll be emphasizing. Think about in our time what we call about the ideas in the air. Think about such things as Black Lives Matter, climate change, transgender, immigration policies. We haven't entered into all of those with our own lives. In the same way, I want to suggest to you that things in the air in Wister's time, I can't say that he entered into all of these, but I think they were in the air. I think they were ideas. And if you think about what was popular in 1900 about the American West, begin with James Fenimore Cooper, because he introduced the ingredients that Wister would use. And remember that Cooper was internationally famous until the 1850s or 60s. Think about Daniel Boone and the rise of frontier heroes. And if you remember, Wister was a member of the Boone and Crockett Club, so he knew a lot about the heroes of that sort. Think about people moving west into the Oregon Territory in the Gold Rush. And the idea in the air was winning the West. And by the middle of the 19th century, that was a theme that was very, very much in the air. Think about the local color writers Gary's written a lot about Bret Harte and Mark Twain. I've written about Mary Hallett Foote, and they're all writers that were local color writers emphasizing the West. Those were people that were in the air for Wister. Think about the dime novelists, and the dime novelists had stopped writing about the South because there was such negativity in the North versus the South. They turned to the frontier. So in the dime novels, you could see an awful lot of emphasis on the West, even if they didn't talk so much about cowboys. So the dime novels were in the air too. And then think about the burst of interest that Gary has written about in historical fiction right around the turn of the century. So that meant that there were a lot of things in the air. And then think about Teddy Roosevelt, who was a good friend of Wister's. And something that I don't quite understand, but it happened in Wister's life in 1885, the Western cure. You remember where Mitchell, his relative, says, go west. And so in 1885, he went west, and he said he felt like either a schoolboy on the first day out of school or a prisoner on his first day out of prison. And he reacted to this, and it was a kind of cure for him because he disliked so much what his father was suggesting. So all of those things were in the air, and they were things that Wister inherited. And so when you think about his writing from the 1880s until 1902, those were subjects that he had. Well, let's talk to his contributions. Professor Allmendinger already mentioned the kinds of formula ingredients that were introduced. Let me repeat them. The three things: the valiant romantic hero, the rascal or evil villain, and the virginal heroine. That goes all the way back to Cooper, and it was in the dime novels too. And so those were things that he inherited, but there were things that he brought and put into his novels too. And certainly, most people say he wrote the first very popular cowboy novel. Gary uses the word cowboy Superman, and I think that's exactly right to talk about what he did. So what he did is he pulled together the ingredients of previous ingredients about the West. And that standard trilogy went all the way back to Cooper. He introduced the Western setting, the cowboy ranching, and I'm the son of a bass sheepherder. So if I were writing that novel and I were taking out of my experiences, it would be in 1902, it would have been a bass sheepherder who would have been, that wasn't the hero. The cowboy was the hero. And there's no question that the cowboy hero grabbed the public. Adventure, action in the West. Gary uses the word that he was romantic throughout his life, and I agree with that, very much so. Well, there are other things that sometimes we don't mention in the novel. Let me mention 4 or 5. One, the intriguing use of the narrator, the I character. Most of the Zane Grey, even the Louis L'Amour, so take the tradition of popular Westerns throughout that period, they did not use the I narrator. And Wister did both. He did the third person, but also the first person. And that first person added the ingredient of the Easterner reacting to the West. If the Virginian was a Southerner and brought his ingredients to Wyoming, the narrator brings the East to the West. He certainly did also bring other notable characters that sometimes we don't mention. Think about Steve, his friend, who turns out to be something of a rustler, and Virginian winces in involving himself in the hanging of Steve. Think about Shorty, the sort of innocent young man abroad who loves horses, and what happens in that ingredient. Think about Scipio, who's an in-between character. Those characters are not emphasized enough when we just do the trilogy of the villain, the hero, and the heroine. Gary emphasizes, and I think it's right. By the way, Gary's the only person among us who's written a book about Owen Wister, so I'm using that. He talks about the setting descriptions, and Wister was more interested in the environment than many other people, and he castigates, for example, the trash, the overdevelopment that occurs, and that was something. On the other hand, it's probably more interesting to us than it was then, because we've become alarmed to what after the 1970s and 80s, what environmentalism is? Now, I want to talk to you about what I think to be a major contribution that most people don't talk about. Historians during this time were enamored with Frederick Jackson Turner because in 1893, he had talked about the frontier. What many people don't realize is that Turner, about 1910, began to talk about second kind of West. He called it sections. We would call it region. So that he devoted as much time to the West as region as he did frontier. But so often we're enamored with the frontier, we don't get to the second section. I would like to make a case that Wister is a person who also gave us both the frontier and the region in this novel. Here it goes. When the Virginian arrives in Wyoming, it's like a wide open space with the cattle sort of in charge. But as the novel develops, we see the establishment of a town, we see the establishment of a school, we see other kinds of establishments. And so what you see is the beginning of the West as a kind of second stage. Here's the words I use. The first is the going to the West historiography. The second is in the West historiography. And so what you have is the frontier theme and going to the West. But in the second one, you have the West as region, the developing. And if you remember in the novel, you move chronologically through the to the West to in the West. And remember in the last pages, what you have is the Wister now being a landowner, being an owner and bringing in the railroads and being a person who's developing the West. I would suggest to you what Wister does in that novel is what Frederick Jackson Turner was doing in historiography. And that's a very important thing to keep in mind as you look at this novel. Okay, then the last part of what I'd like to say is the legacies. And I have a warning. Too many people read history backwards. They ought to read it forwards. Because if you read it backwards, then there's a good deal of villainy in Wister, that he was the introducer of these formulas. And you know about Louis L'Amour, you know about Zane Grey, you know about Ernest Haycox and Luke Short, and you put all of their limitations on the shoulders of Wister. Read it forward. He introduced these things and they were so popular that other people grabbed them. Now, let me introduce something that's in our time and that gives us a very, I think, illuminating example. I hope some of you recognize the name Colleen Hoover. Colleen Hoover right now is writing popular fiction. Think about this. A lady who has sold 20 million copies of her books since 2014. She's done over 20. And you ask yourself, if you look at those, I will tell you that they are so popular that other people will grab what she's done and emphasize it, like people did with Owen Wister's Virginia. It was so popular, it sold so well that people like Zane Grey and writers of the Purple Sage in 1912 developed it. Know this, the Western is the most popular form of literature in the United States from about 1915 into the 1930s. Zane Grey was the bestseller between 1915 and the early 1930s. And it was so popular, it helped to bring in the movie. In the 1920s, the Western film was the most popular kind of film. And I'm suggesting to you that Wister introduced these ingredients. If you read history forward, it's important to see all of the things that he contributed. So to end up, he contributed to the cowboy novel. He gave us a Trans-Mississippi novel. He introduced women characters. And so that if we look at the tradition, he's very important as an introducer of major ideas about the American West.
Thank you, Dick. This may be a violation of the format I previously set up, but I'd like to ask you a very quick question, perhaps you can address. I think it's fair, of course, to trace Wister's roots back to Cooper. But are there any distinctions that you would want to make between Cooper's West and Wister's West, or Cooper's hero and Wister's hero?
Well, with the point that I was making, Gary, about the to the West and in the West and to the West, that you don't get that in Cooper. Cooper does in the West, and he, remember, his West is Western New York. And so what Wister does is he introduces the Trans-Mississippi West. And many people had moved in their ideas from that frontier of Cooper to the West. And there was this idea of the winning of the West that was not there in Cooper. So in the 50 to 75 years between Cooper and Wister, we moved to the Trans-Mississippi West, we moved to the cowboy. And so there were different kinds of West between the Cooper and Wister.
All right. I may want to quarrel with you a bit after a while.
That's fine.
But before I do that, we, of course, should also hear from Professor Weltzien.
Weltzien. Well, I would like to talk about a couple of lines of influence, and then a couple of, in Dick's term, a couple of aspects of the legacy or legacies of the Virginian. On Wiki, I mean, it doesn't take long to for any of us to determine the actual foundational nature of this novel. The thousands, X thousands of new copies that are sold per year, the rich ongoing cultural conversation that the Virginian initiated. There are 4 film adaptations, according to what I looked up, between 1914 and 1946. There is an NBC TV series that runs for 9 seasons in the 1960s, when I'm an overweight kid eagerly watching. A couple of these panelists have written a lot more than I know about where Wister comes from, but I do want to cite, 2 or 3 books along the way. I think for those of you who are participating in this conversation today, to understand more about the sort of genre founding position, as well as the complexities, the nuances that inhabit the Virginian, I can't recommend strongly enough reading the Virginian in the New West, which came out, an anthology edited by Melody Gralick and Steve Tatum, and was published back in '03. Gary has an essay in it, and I can't remember at this moment if Dick or you, Blake, are also in that collection, but it sure gives one a nice set of lenses through which to see what the Virginia has meant across the 20th century, and also the way that the conversation continues into the century that we find ourselves in now. I wanted to mention a book by a historian that happens to be a friend of mine. It's called Up the Trail by Tim Lehman, and Dick actually blurbed this book that was published in 2018. The subtitle, How Texas Cowboys Herded Longhorns and Became an American Icon. And for our purposes today, it's the last section, the last long chapter of Tim's book that is of interest, because he documents in great detail how and why, quote, there was more profit in cowboy stories than cowboy labor, end quote, or that marketing transformed the cowboy into a gunslinger and made him more interested in rescuing fair maidens than following cows. There's a fairy in the hands of the dime novelists, the Ned Buntlines and lots of others. Cattle actually disappear from the cultural icon that emerges really quickly, it seems to me. And I also wanted to mention a book called Becoming Western by a historian I also know named Liza Nicholas. Becoming Western, which stories of culture and identity in the cowboy state. This was published back in 2008. And Nicholas's study looks at how the state of Wyoming itself represents a complicated and ambivalent cultural construction that's negotiated between Easterners and locals in the 1870s and 80s. And after all, Wyoming, if I'm not mistaken, becoming a state only a dozen years before the Virginian, which is obviously set all in Wyoming, is published. And it's a what strikes you in if you look at Becoming Western is what an artifact this thing called Wyoming was and perhaps remains. For some of us in the least most populous state, which is my neighboring state, the bucking bronco license plate icon is maybe the most ongoing, the salient example of this way in which Wyoming has kind of remained a sink or a repository for a lot of national imagining, or as scholars say, imaginary, about what constitutes the West, transnational or otherwise. In what time I've got left, I wanted to sing the praises of this Montana novelist I've kind of been the cheerleader of for too many years, named Thomas Savage. And Thomas Savage is one of the biggest novelists, actually, from the Northern Rockies, it turns out, across the 20th century, a 13-novel career from the 1940s through the end of the 1980s. And Thomas Savage grew up on a cattle ranch and a sheep ranch, Dick, as it turns out, not all that far from his hometown, Dillon, Montana, where I notice I have lived for 31 years now. Savage knew very well the place and the fraught, perhaps I could add, fraught legacy, or at least one fraught legacy from the Virginian as a genre-founding novel, because in at least 5 of his novels, he cites the Virginian. And he usually talks about the Virginian in variably sarcastic and satiric ways. And he sets up, this happens from his first novel called The Pass in 1944 through his 11th novel, which is called Her Side of It, which was published in 1981. And I was going to originally read some passages, but I don't think I'll do all that now. What's of interest is the way that this minor novelist, who has been recently rediscovered to some extent, locates a realistic Western literary novel, his own, over against this extraordinarily potent genre, where an idealistic, or at least if that's too fraught of a term, a romantic West obtains and remains in strong form in popular cultural production, which it tends to efface the literary Western set novel of someone like this Thomas Savage. In The Pass, I'll just read one of these. In the first novel, this concerns a young couple who are founding a cattle ranch. So it's the first 2 novels by this guy sets up his, what I call Savage West. He's kind of creating his version of what the Intermountain West actually is. And in his world, it's a harsh and lonely place that tends to destroy people. So it's not happily ever after, it's far from it. In the first novel, the newlyweds, Jess and Beth Bentley, are given a copy of the Virginian as a Christmas present, as a wedding present. And then at a winter social event, which is the Masonic Hall's winter dance, the Virginian makes its way into the text again. I'm just quoting a line or two from my book, my biography. At the Masonic Hall's winter dance, the middle-aged spinster school teacher, another cliche, introduces Jess as, quote, a rancher, but a cowboy also, end quote, to the young new school teacher fresh from Minnesota, who, quote, has been reading the Virginian and wants to know all about cowboys. And it seems to me that in this novelist, in Thomas Savage's career, he's asking us to question the space between the Western, the Virginian and the popular imagination, and the what the cultural icon of, say, the Eastern literary establishment, whether that's Philadelphia or Boston or somewhere else, or New York, versus and a homegrown, authentic version of West. This is what West actually is. At least this is what ranch actually is, because this is my story. And I tend to think that this novelist writes autobiographically consistently. 8 of his 11 of his 13 novels are all set in Southwest Montana and in the Lemhi River Valley of Idaho. So a writer like Tom Savage is pretty pissed off with the place of the Virginian. That's not to necessarily to dispute the Virginian at all. That is that simply reminds us, though, of the central position that this novel has had since its original publication 120 years ago. I don't know if that's 12 minutes plus, Gary, but I'll stop there for now.
Well, thank you. As you were talking, Alan, I was reminded of the critical commonplace about Wister's novel, that it's a cowboy novel without any cows. Which perhaps brings us to the larger question, how realistic is Wister's representation of the West? To cite but one very minor example, Henry James, one of Wister's friends, and of course a novelist in his own right, the master, as he's sometimes called, James thought the Virginian should have died in the shootout with Trampas at the end of the novel. He thought that Wister sold out by having the hero vanquish the villain and then live happily ever after. Are there, and this is an open question to our entire panel, how else does Wister romanticize the West? What else can we point to that in the end is not terribly realistic? I asked the question in no small part because we have no open questions from our viewers yet.
Well, I'll fire one salvo. I appreciate, Dick, your reminding us all of those, that I think you cited 4 or 5 characters in the Virginian that, frankly, who are crucial in different novelistic or character ways, but who are always eclipsed by the dynamic of the core triangle. And arguably that triangle comes, does it not, from conventions, for example, in 19th century theater? I mean to say, this is the stuff of melodrama. And there's a lot of melodramatic energy that precipitates in what is the first showdown. And obviously a lot of us love showdowns. That doesn't seem to go away.
I might add here, of course, that Wister also collaborated in a dramatization of the Virginian, which remained on the stage at the height of the Romantic West early in the century. It, in fact, remained in production off and on for the next 25 years or so. Anyone else want to weigh in on the question of realism versus the romance of the
Gary,
West?
The division you're talking about between the romantic and the realistic is still very much alive in the way people react to the history of the West in our own time. I'll give you two examples. Probably the most popular magazines about the American West are called Wild West and True West. And their circulation is magnificent compared to Western American literature, Western Historical Review, if we use those as examples of the academics. There's still that very much that division. There are organizations that fit the scholarly people, and there are organizations that fit the popular. Here's the irony for us who are scholars. Our books attract much less general attention than those that are writing in the popular genre. It rankles that none of our books ever appear on the bestseller list, and theirs sometimes do. Think in our own time of the novels by Box, the author that writes about the mountain areas, or think about the Yellowstone series. Those are tremendously popular in our time, but the scholarly things are not attracting as much attention. I think Wister was on the track of emphasizing the romantic because he wanted to sell a book that would do well. And that if you wrote history in his time, think about books, even though Turner was popular among the academics, he was not popular among the general public.
If I could pick up on that point, I agree with you perhaps about his motivation. And I'm thinking of as someone in California who also teaches a course just on California literature, the importance of Helen Hunt Jackson's novel Ramona, because she originally wrote it hoping to call attention to the plight of Native Americans in California. But she thought the best way to do that would be to turn it into kind of a fairy tale romance between Ramona, who's a half-breed or biracial, and a full-blooded Native American. And that novel, the romantic story, the marriage plot, seized upon a reader's imaginations to such an extent that they forgot all about the plight of Native Americans and did not legislate for action to protect them the way that perhaps people did after reading Uncle Tom's Cabin, which was another sentimental novel that was written to call attention to slavery and abolition. Unfortunately, maybe Jackson was so good at romanticizing her subject that people still cite Ramona all the time on street signs and buildings and the Ramona Festival pageant every year. But I don't know how much attention they pay to the historical underpinnings of that story. I also think that Jackson was more of a missionary in having that kind of zealousness. I don't know about Wister if he was trying to promote certain awarenesses of the West that were not romanticized. I like your point very much about the trash that you see in Medicine Bow, even early on in the 1880s, as they ride out the next day after the narrators arrived on the train, and there's tin cans and other non-biodegradable trash that's going to linger outside of Medicine Bow and never really go away. And I think a little moment like that reminds us of the real West times too.
I would love to mention that, which I did not before, in Thomas Savage's second novel. This is called Lona Hansen, and it was published in 1948. And in Lona Hansen, there is a character named Clyde Barrows. And Clyde Barrows, are you ready, folks, is a sickly Eastern novelist who comes out west to regain his health, to somehow go inside and become native, and overcome his writer's block. That in and of itself, aside from the references to the Clyde of Clyde Griffiths in Dreiser's An American Tragedy, which this character in Lona Hansen talks about, there's also a nice mocking glance, I hope, at Clyde Barrows of Bonnie and Clyde, which is a different version of a Trampus outlaw West. But that's yet another example of an inside or a native Intermountain West Northern Rockies novelist, absolutely aware of the indisputable position, however romantic and distorted it is, of the Virginian.
I would add a couple of points here, echoing both Dick and Blake, that Wister's introducing a kind of environmental ethic into the novel. I actually jotted down the piles of rubbish that dot the prairie. The narrator remarks on, quote, "The empty sardine box rusting over the face of the Western earth, the thick heaps and fringes of tin cans and shelving mounds of bottles cast out of the saloons." I think that is a realistic element in the novel. Sometimes other readers will point to the scene in which Balaam plucks the eye out of Pedro as one of the more realistic elements in the novel. Although I would quickly add that the original version of that episode in Wister's diary is far more realistic than the version that got into the novel. Indeed, Wister rewrote the version in the short story Balaam and Pedro at the insistence of Theodore Roosevelt. The scene as it appears finally in the novel is almost incomprehensible. We have no clear idea what has happened. We can only more or less infer it. Having said all that, let me add, Dick, I think in particular, I'd like to hear you on this point. There are virtually no Indians in, or Blake, who spoke about Ramona, there are virtually no Indians in the Virginian. There are a few at the bridge when it's being repaired for the railroad. Otherwise, they all appear off stage. Even the attack on the Virginian is not described explicitly. And that strikes me as a curious omission among many omissions, if we're going to read this novel in any sense as a realistic treatment of the West.
Gary, here's an example of the question you ask and some that are on the chat. How much we take from our consciousness and experience to a novel written in 1902. Think about one of the questions on the chat is having to do with Molly Wood and the experience. You just asked the question about Native American experience, and you just mentioned stuff about environmentalism. Think about the 1902 reader. It's interesting that very few of the popular Westerns had Indians on scene. We sometimes think I played cowboys and Indians when I grew up, but the novelists usually had the bad guys being other white guys, or like Trampas, and Trampas seems to have a mixed heritage. You're interested in the environmentalism in there. I wonder if 1902 readers even saw the trash. And some people say, including Gary Scharnhorst, that in fact this novel was probably written for male readers. Well, what Wister was doing, I think, is addressing things that were popular in 1902. When we look at it from 2022, there are things missing that are in our eyes. Environmentalism, roles of women, and minority groups. And he didn't have that. That wasn't something he emphasized, but we do.
Yeah, I would just remind us that of what a racialized version of the West the Virginian happens to be. This book I mentioned earlier, historian Tim Lehman's book about the Texas Cowboys, and how in one generation or less that gets transformed about 180 degrees into this icon, that it's almost a medieval white knight tradition in which, or from which, Hispanic Americans, gaucho traditions, tribal peoples, cowboy, horse or otherwise, everybody is gone. They're disappeared. So it's as though we're more back, or Wister takes us more back into a tabula rasa mythology, as though it's unpeopled and empty space to be founded.
Thank you. Let me reply to Dick, if only briefly. This becomes a little esoteric, but Dick, you're familiar with Wister's essay, The Evolution of the Cowpuncher, which was published in 1895. And in that essay, Wister is pretty upfront about his xenophobia. He mutes it, he chastens it in the novel, I think, but he refers to the immigrant vermin that was polluting the West. Trampas, as you suggest correctly, I think, is a kind of hybridized character. His last name is the cognate of the Spanish word for trick, and his first name, when he first appears in the short story Ballam Pedro, is Sorgi, which is a cognate of Sorg, the German word for trouble. That is, Wister originally, apparently, thought of him as an immigrant type or a chauffeur who is fired by the Virginian in an early chapter, clearly a German immigrant type. There is a kind of undercurrent, I think, of xenophobia or racism that I'm assuming even early 20th century readers would have detected. Scipio would seem to be a character with some African-American ancestry, but even he insists that he and his family, quote, have been white for 100 years. That is, he's whitewashed by Wister. He's even described as having bleached blue eyes. In short, I think that there is a case to be made for the, well, for want of a better word, the racism of the novel.
No question, Gary, but again, I'm going to say where we are and where they were.
Yeah.
Here's Teddy Roosevelt saying something to Wister about his racism, but here's Teddy Roosevelt. Out of 10 Indians, 9 I don't like, and I have questions about the 10th. Well, here you have the leading politician reacting, and the progressive period, which Wister was a part of, they did not pay attention to minorities and the things we're interested in. It amazes me that we have come so far in 120 years, but what we need to do is be careful not to take 222 and superimpose it on 1902. It doesn't open many doors for us. Yes, I would use this very explicit, Gary. Owen Wister, by our definition, was a diehard racist, no question about that. Also, in that, he was a participant in major ideas and trends of his time.
Yeah, maybe I have a question about this that I've never been able to answer. Maybe you guys have your own reading of it, but I agree with everything that's been said. But then I also struggle with why is it that occasionally the narrator refers to the Virginian as the black man. I assume it's because he has black hair, but he also comes from a state that's really more the South than it is the West. And wasn't his grandmother Fanny Kimball, who married a plantation owner and who was an actress? And she wrote a book about her life on a plantation. And I don't know what his thoughts or his relationship with her was, but I wonder if there's a racial subtext that I keep kind of missing. I feel it's almost there, but not enough that I can work with. And I'm not sure if it's there, what it's really saying. Is it equating the Virginian with a person of color to call the black man? I can't make that thesis work in my mind, but then I don't know how else to account for some of these things. And I think one of the songs that he or one of the cowboys sings in the book is actually can be traced back to a plantation song that was sung by slaves, according to Lomax and Lomax. So I don't know if you have any thoughts about that, but those are things I've never been able to clear up for myself.
Well, I would only note the irony, yeah, that the Virginian is described as black at one point, but it really does, I think, refer to his hair. He's also described on another occasion as swarthy. On the other hand, the only blonde character in the novel is Shorty. I think there's a profound irony there. I think Wister is playing with racial types in both their cases, but in an ironic way that I can't make sense of either. Having said all that, let me add to my criticism that Indians mostly appear off stage, that there are no buffalo cowboys in the novel. Scipio is not a cowboy, even if he has some African-American ancestry. In fact, he's hired as a cook, that is basically as a domestic worker, as a servant type. So we've got these, in my opinion, racial blind spots that flaw the novel. Yes, Dick, even from my perspective, from a 1902 perspective. Having said all that, maybe we can turn the page to another sense in which, in my opinion, the novel is not very realistic, and that's the character of Molly Stark Wood, who would seem to be Wister's version of a feminist. It's point's been often made that Wyoming, which admitted in its state constitution when it became a state, recognizing the state recognized the right of women to vote. It was the very first, if not simply one of the first states to recognize women's suffrage. That Molly Wood would come from the east to Wyoming, that she's obviously independent, independent-minded, would seem to suggest that Wister meant her as a type of feminist, although I would quickly add that she's been thoroughly domesticated by the end of the novel. Is there a sense in which others among you would want to take on the character of Molly Wood, comment upon her?
Gary, I will do it by commenting on the great aunt and the mom too. That I think he uses the strength of his Virginian character as a person that is so strong and winsome that he can in fact influence certainly the great aunt and Molly, that his ideas and actions are right, and in doing so, they will have to transform their attitudes to his. He never is able to convert the mom to that. She ends the novel sort of not knowing exactly how to respond to him and whether the marriage is a good idea. But the great aunt and Molly come around large part to his points of view. And I think that's because Wister wanted to show him as being such a strong character that he could win them over to his positions.
I mentioned Thomas Savage's The Past, and I mentioned there are two generations of school teachers who are passing on the lore of the Virginian explicitly. And that makes me wonder if this is just what this tells us about reading and about teacher education and about what constitutes being educated and its relationship to the construction of female identity. And I wonder if that young school teacher, who's only on one page of that 1944 novel, will, in her new life there, settle into become a Molly, or if there will be any other plot imaginable or actual for her that might open up. And I was thinking when you were posing the question, Gary, of a different kind of woman who came to Wyoming. I'm thinking of John McPhee's Rising from the Plains, published about 1980. And if you remember this story, it's in part the story of David, field geologist David Love's remarkable parents. And the mother in particular, Ethel Waxham, I believe, who early in this nonfiction book is going by stagecoach from Rawlins with her Phi Beta Kappa key from Massachusetts to become a teacher on this ranch. But then the rest of Rising from the Plains shows how she, in fact, while becoming a wife and a mother and everything else, assumes a kind of independence, not to say a feminist identity, that I think is a little bit beyond where Molly's at.
Maybe another, Gary, parallel. Think about the only woman writing Westerns during this time. And this is Allen's bailiwick, B.M. Bauer. And in Chip of the Flying U, a similar kind of situation. The school teacher woman is changed by the cowboy. And if I remember correctly, it's the cowboy's point of view that wins over the school teacher. It isn't the school teacher that changes the cowboy.
Right, thank you,
While we're on the topic, I should throw in a comment about Bret Harte, because I think Harte invents the character of the Eastern schoolmarm who goes west in The Idol of Red Gulch. And she encounters a vulgar Westerner in that short story. And by the end of the story, the Eastern schoolmarm has fled back to the East. That is to say, Wister is certainly not developing an Eastern schoolmarm who maintains a kind of feminist identity. Indeed, the Virginian declares, "Miss Wood shall teach school no more when she is mine." She becomes a conventional wife and mother.
Sometimes I think you could do a rewriting of this novel and make Molly actually the hero, because going back to the question, why aren't there many Indians in the novel? I used to assume it was because historically, by that time, the Indians were either mostly had been removed to reservations or had been killed and were no longer much of a real threat unless they got off the reservation. And by the end of the novel, Molly has taken the Virginian off the market and tamed him and made him settle down to become a husband and father. I think the last line is something about his progeny who will continue the line after him. But of course, most cowboys didn't marry. And once they did, they weren't cowboys any longer, usually, because no woman wanted to stay at home while her husband went on an 8-month trail drive. So in a way, I don't find that also goes back to the question of Gary's question about to what extent does the novel romanticize history? I think that the idea of making Molly the romantic object for which she ultimately strives is a way of showing her his love for her conquering his desire to be free, settling down. And I don't like the ending because I like to imagine the Virginian goes on being the cowboy who's back to the wilderness. I can't really imagine him sitting in a lazy boy with a grandchild on his lap, and a spittoon by his side. I don't want to imagine him that way in any kind of domestic life, but that's what kind of triumphs at the end of the novel. So I almost feel like there's a way you could make Molly not a feminist heroine, but kind of in a way, the one who tames him while remaining in her stereotypical role as a school marm / wife / mother. I don't know.
Well, I'm going to turn the page yet again to another question, which we haven't really touched on yet, which is the rationalization or the justification of lynch law in the novel. Judge Henry explains why he commissioned the Virginian to lead the posse that hangs Steve this way. The law has been letting our cattle thieves go for 2 years. People must take justice back. Call this primitive, if you will, but so far from being a defiance of the law, it's an assertion of it, the fundamental assertion of self-governing men upon whom our whole social fabric is based. That is, as Wister tells his story, John Locke is on the side of the vigilantes. Henry draws a distinction between burning Southern Negroes in public and hanging Western cattle thieves in private. Is that a fair distinction?
Well, Gary, we know, because you did the research in the same archives I did, that there was no question that Wister sided with the cattle owners in the Johnson County War in the early 1890s. And he didn't side with the people that were challenging those large cattlemen. Steve is a challenger of those. And even though Wister likes Steve, what he does is he sides with the cattlemen because the Steves are challenging them. So what we see in the novel is a replication of what Wister stood for in his own life. He was the champion for the large cattlemen. He was not the champion for those who were challenging those large cattlemen.
Okay. I don't know if this adds to the conversation, but in Jack Schaefer's movie, Shane, we have the same story told from the point of view of the small ranchers. But let me come back to that question, because Wister, in his third and final novel, Lady Baltimore, really offers an unapologetic defense of lynching. That is to say, the distinction he draws in the Virginian between burning Southern Negroes in public and hanging Western cattle thieves in private, he erases by that third novel.
Wow.
What is Lady Baltimore about, Gary? I've never read that.
It's sort of a novel of manners set in Charleston, South Carolina, published in 1906.
Where he finished the Virginian, right, Gary?
Right.
Yeah.
And the novel becomes a kind of extended debate about race and racism in the South. The narrator of the novel at one point declares to her suitor, it's the white, the American citizen, the hope of humanity, as he enjoys being called, who, after our English-speaking race has abolished public executions, degenerates back to the Stone Age. It's upon him that lynching works the true injury. That is to say, in Lady Baltimore, according to Wister, lynching harms the lyncher more than the person or people lynched.
Oh, it makes me want to read that novel now. I wasn't even aware of that. Wow.
Well, let me turn the page yet again. And Dick, you will be able to tell where I'm going with this simply by the way I asked the question. Why is the hero of the Virginian unnamed, or is he unnamed?
Yeah.
I don't know where you're going, Gary.
Oh, well, actually, he is given a name once by Steve. He's called Jeff.
Yeah.
Maybe that will help you guess where I'm going. Dick, why is he, at least in passing, called Jeff?
Well, I think I've seen somebody say something about Jefferson, but I don't know for sure.
Yeah, one critic suggests that he's named after Jefferson Davis. I think that's stupid.
Yeah.
He's actually named after Thomas Jefferson, I think. And he's repeatedly compared with George Washington. He quotes the Declaration of Independence at one point. All men are born equal, or nearly quotes it. He's compared to George Washington by Molly Wood. It wasn't that George Washington couldn't tell a lie, he just wouldn't. And of course, he does tell a lie in his rhetorical victory over Krampus.
Well, you know, maybe the best way to for us to answer that question is to see that the Virginian remains a type more than an individual, and I would connect that type, Gary, with the conversation about your preceding question, the inquiry about lynching, and where Wister's racism weighed in, and it's pretty clear that. To the extent that Virginia, where I notice a state, a very strange state, where I notice I spent at least 15 years trying to understand a few things, I guess, and survive graduate school and a job. If this is the aristocratic essence of Civil War, or this is the distillation of the South, according to an absolutely class-driven South, then that essence is what comes out west to prevail there and rewrite in this so-called, as I mentioned earlier, tabula rasa, and kind of rewrite the order according to the elite and white establishment of which Wister is a member and proponent and advocate. Absolutely. Others don't have a place. So just the big cattlemen have a place, and they are the same skin color as Owen is.
Gary, one of the questioners asks, is the Virginian really an example of the move toward reconciliation between North and South after the Civil War? Well, that's an interesting question. And I think the tension, or maybe the combination, in Wister's life is illuminative here. So one of you asked, or it came up earlier, about the Fanny Kemble sort of background, about his mom and that side. There was a good deal of pro-Southern interest in that side, but there was Wister, the Harvard man, too. And his Pennsylvania background was some of that. And I think he did think about reconciliation, and he did think about the West as a possibility where there could be reconciliation. But he brought the prejudices, we see them now, of the Eastern elite from his Northern background, but also his anti-interest in Black people in his Southern prejudices too. So the reconciliation that somebody says maybe is in the Virginia, yes, but with limitations, with its Eastern biases and with its Southern biases.
Yes, I agree. The reconciliation novel, we've been talking about the Western novel, but the reconciliation novel was a type of formulaic late 19th century, early 20th century novel as well, pioneered by John W. DeForest's Miss Ravenel's conversion from secession to loyalty, developed by Albion Tourgui's A Fool's Errand. It's not coincidental that in the Virginian we have a New England schoolmarm and a Virginian who meet in the West, fall in love, and marry. So reconciliation of the regions.
And it happens in Wyoming, Gary. The West might be the site for reconciliation.
Right.
Well, that just reinforces the point about the Wyoming as a constructed cultural entity, perhaps much more so constructed from the East than from locals, however recently they arrived.
We're nearly out of time for the Q&A. Let me answer my own question about why I think the Virginian is almost never named, why he invokes both Geoffrey Washington. It's because, as Wister writes in the first paragraph of his introduction, Wyoming between 1874 and 1890 was a colony as wild as was Virginia 100 years earlier. The Virginian, an avatar of the revolutionary generation of Virginians, in fact, like Jefferson and Washington, is a leader of the lynch, of the posse that lynches Steve. He becomes, in effect, a kind of leader of the Revolutionary Army that is vanquishing the invaders, those who would rustle cattle. Wister, in fact, I think his first book after the Virginian was a biography of George Washington, in which he is sometimes described as the Virginian. And I'm even going to go a bit out on a limb here. Judge Henry, who in the anti-feminist parable Emily, one of the first stories that Wister wrote, that he developed into the novel, Judge Henry in that chapter is called Judge Henny. Wister changes his name, I think, to evoke, if you will, Patrick Henry, who was a patron of both Washington and Jefferson. So there are lots of threads here, not many of which we've tied together today, but I think that's for the best. And with that, perhaps we can turn to the three of you for your closing statements, whatever you have to say. So Blake, please lead us off.
I would like to use the time I have left just to respond briefly to some other questions that came up, which I didn't notice on the talk when I was talking. I wanted to respond to Joseph Levin, who had the first question when he said, isn't the gaucho in Argentina also a romanticized version of the cowboy? I would say yes. And if you're interested in looking at comparative versions of the cowboys in other countries, there's a great book by Richard Slatta called Cowboys of the Americas, which looks at the gaucho figure, at the Cossack figure in Russia, at outback versions of the cowboy in Australia, the vaquero, for example, you might enjoy reading that book. For Andrew Nelson, who wonders why all the film adaptations suck. He liked the TV series. I have to agree, and I don't know the reason. The one even starred Gary Cooper, who was one of my favorites. Last night I watched the first silent film version, which is horrible. Yeah, hard to watch. From 1914, it's about 50 minutes long. It's not bad, but I mean, it's not great. That's a good. I don't know the answer to that question. I liked the comment from someone named Fern, which was about going back to the novel being a reconciliation between the North and the South. That's an intriguing idea because, you know, in Bill Handley's book on the marriage plot, he looks at how it unites the East and the West and different parts of the country together. Turner, I think, said, I think of all the controversial things he wrote in his essay, he said that the story of Manifest Destiny is the most single important story of the 19th century or historical event, even more so than the Civil War. So nowadays people might find that controversial to say, but it reminds us that there was this kind of a horizontal axis and a vertical axis. And when you look at the tensions between those opposing regions, it would be intriguing to think if whatever the novel might be saying about race, if it is saying anything, ties into this idea of reconciliation between North and South. And then for the person from Mount Liberty College who said, isn't the real influence of women out West that they bring the church and civilization out West? I would say that's definitely a stereotype that we see. I guess it was factually true to a large extent, but yeah, that would be a way of again seeing how Molly, in a sense, is the one who tames the Virginian, if you wanted to do that kind of a reading of it. So, but I did appreciate the questions we got asked.
Thank you. Dick, I'm going to interject before I come to you again, that there actually was a fifth adaptation of the Virginian starring Dennis Weaver, I think a made-for-TV movie, but it sucked too, Blake, so we don't really need to spend any time on it. But let me add that I think there has been one successful adaptation of the Virginian, although it's not often recognized as an adaptation of the novel, and that's the movie High Noon, in which Gary Cooper, who had played the Virginian, is the hero. That movie essentially adapts the climactic scene in the Virginian with Grace Kelly in the role of the Eastern schoolmarm.
The Quaker schoolmarm, Gary.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah.
Dick, share your thoughts with us.
I'm going to be repetitious because my mind works best when I hear an idea the second time. So I'm going to repeat two things that I said. One, read history forward rather than backward to understand how much Owen Wister's Virginian meant for an audience of 1902, rather than reading it backwards from 2022. And I think that will help us to understand. No reason why we can't have an environmental, a racial, ethnic, a transnational, all those readings, but to realize that those are the ideas we have gung-ho. Those were not ideas that were gung-ho in 1902. And the second idea, not only to read history forward, but to realize that Wister was giving us the to the West and in the West images. True, it's mainly in the West, but there's also in the West, building the West as region. And really, when you think about it, if you know the interpretations of the West, He was introducing something that became gung-ho for the next 30 years among literary historians and historians, that the West was region was just as important as the West as frontier. If you think of those two things, reading history forward, that he introduces the frontier and the West, I think those are two reasons to reread this book and to think about it again.
Thank you. And we'll turn to Alan.
I want to talk about ranches for a moment and to try to suggest that part of the reason that the Virginian occupies the position that it does is that it appeals to adolescence. It appeals to a national adolescent psychology, perhaps. So if the Virginian starts out as a hand and then he becomes a foreman, and by the end he's going to be a cattleman, he's an owner, it's not only happily ever after, it's wealthy ever after. And Steve Tatum in reading the Virginian and the New West has an excellent essay on the honeymoon scene, which is the romanticized version of being in nature, perhaps, but then quitting it. And so we hear the sound of coal trains, of natural resources exploitation at the end of the Virginian also. So ranches are the Intermountain West version extension of Jeffersonian agrarian democracy. This is as good as it can get, folks, if you happen to be in the wide West, at least in a state like mine, Montana. But I was talking about Tom Savage, and I was mentioned particularly his first two novels, The Pass and Lona Hansen. In the first case, the wife and the baby die. And so at the end of the novel, Jess Bentley has his cattle and no family. So the foundational ranch move fails. In Lona Hansen, which is set in the Depression and is Tom Savage's version of, let's say, Jane Smiley's 1,000 Acres from 40 years earlier, she's ended up the great granddaughter of the 20,000 acre ranches and ends up absolutely isolated. She's alone. She's being blackmailed by a hand. All of her family is driven away. All of her friendships or relationships are over. Tom Savage's point is that ranches destroy families, destroy people. So there is a gap between the idealistic, not to say romantic version of what Western inhabitation consists in, with this being the ranch being the ultimate the top of the pile, versus a much harsher assessment that a novelist like a Tom Savage writes. I think most people prefer to think that you can have a ranch, even in our world out here, quote unquote, out here, whereas we all know family ranches have been disappearing steadily and even at an accelerating pace in the last 2 generations. That puts the yearning of the Virginian in starker relief. What we want versus what happens.
Thank you. My final thought, and it's not terribly profound, but it does perhaps speak to your point, Dick, about avoiding presentism, which I'm all for. I always defend Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, for example, as a great American novel, even though read in contemporary terms, there's much in it that is abhorrent. I'm going to mention briefly 2 novels that were published almost contemporaneously with the Virginian. One is Frederick Remington's John Erman of the Yellowstone, which is virtually a parody of the Virginian. In fact, while the hero rescues the heroine exactly as the Virginian rescues Molly when she first arrives in the West, that love affair never bears fruit. And in fact, the hero of Remington's novel is killed by the end of the novel. Remington disparaged the Virginian even within a year or two of its publication. The other novel I would mention only in passing is Charlotte Perkins Gilman's The Crux, published in 1910 and recently reissued in a modern edition. Gilman, who mentions the Virginian in her autobiography, clearly rewrites the Virginian as a feminist novel in The Crux. Indeed, her hero, who comes west, is named Vivian. The first two letters of the Virginian and the final three letters of the Virginian. Vivian comes west, civilizes the West, becomes a very successful entrepreneur, and as I suggest, rewrites Wister's vision from a feminist perspective. And with that, I think we're done. If anyone has a final thought, please speak or forever hold your peace.
Maybe Gary, Ivan Doig gives us an in-between story that he talks about. His is a sheep ranch, so I'm attracted to it, but he doesn't have the negativity of Savage, nor does he have the romanticism of Wister. So by giving the story, and this is for Alan up there in Montana and then in Washington, that Ivan Doig gives us an in-between, a ranch story that isn't so full of romanticism, but it's not full of negativity either.
Right.
All right. Well, thank you all. And with
Thank
that,
you.
I think we're ready to ring down the curtain. Thank you.